The dawn of a new age of autofocus SLR photography. The Pentax PZ1, an extension of your mind, a new tool for carrying out your creative intentions. You choose the pictures and the effects you want. The Pentax PZ1 helps you put them on film quickly and easily. It uses the Pentax interactive concept, technological support for your creative ideas. In this video instruction guide, we'll show you how to get the most out of your PZ1. First, we'll look over the key controls on the PZ1. Then we're going to run through the basic operation of the camera. We'll move on to the advanced operations. Finally, we'll see how to set the 18 Pentax functions. These let you customize the PZ1 to fit the way you do photography. This is the shutter release button. Directly behind it is the time value or TV direct dial. On top of the camera is the main switch. Behind it, the aperture value or AV direct dial, the interactive function or IF button, and the memory lock button, the metering mode switch button, and the exposure compensation button. On the left side, the mode dial, the set button, the flash pop-up button, the focus mode switch, the depth of field preview button, the lens lock button. On the lens, the aperture ring, the power zoom ring, the auto zoom switch, the zoom set button, and the focusing ring. To get started taking pictures in the basic operation mode, just set the main switch to the green bar position. But make sure the aperture ring is set to the A position. Hold down the aperture A lock button while turning the ring. Now you can use the PZ1 in programmed auto exposure. Now select one of the three basic drive modes, how you want the film to advance. Set the mode dial to the drive position. While holding down the set button, use the TV direct dial to select a drive mode. You have three choices: single frame drive, continuous drive, and the 12-second self-timer. Power zoom lenses make the PZ1 easy to use. Just turn the power zoom ring to zoom in and out. To zoom manually, pull the zoom ring toward the camera body. The PZ1 offers fast, crisp autofocus. You can choose between three modes using the focus mode switch. When set on single, the lens focuses each time you press the shutter release button. The shutter won't release until the subject is in focus. You'll know it's in focus because the green indicator lights up in the viewfinder. In servo, the lens continuously focuses on the subject as long as the shutter release button is held halfway down. The shutter will release immediately when you fully depress the button. Predictive autofocus ensures you'll get a sharp, clear picture. In manual, you focus the lens yourself. If you want to autofocus on a subject that's not in the center of the frame, use Focus Lock. Looking through the viewfinder, place the autofocus frame over your subject. Hold the shutter release button down halfway. This locks the focus on the subject you want. You can then reframe and take the picture. The PZ1 comes with a built-in TTL auto flash. If there isn't much light, or if your subject is backlit, the flash recommendation indicator on the LCD panel will blink. If you press the shutter release button down halfway, you'll also see the indicator when you look through the lens. To use the built-in TTL auto flash, press the flash pop-up button. In about 3 seconds, the flash indicators will appear in the LCD panel and in the viewfinder, indicating that the flash is charged. With the shutter release halfway down, you'll see the flash sync speed and the aperture setting both on the LCD panel and in the viewfinder. The flash will discharge when you fully depress the shutter release. The advanced functions on the PZ1 let you get the most out of your camera. Set the power switch to the full-on setting. That's the thin bar. It lets you use all of the functions the PZ1 has to offer. The PZ1 has 3 metering options to help you get the right exposure for your picture: 8-segment multi-pattern metering, spot metering, and center-weighted metering. The multi-pattern metering divides the picture into 8 zones. The PZ1's computer measures the light in each zone, then uses this information to select the best exposure for the scene. To select the secondary metering mode, press the metering mode button on the back of the camera and turn the TV direct dial. You'll see the indicator come on and off on the LCD panel. The preset secondary mode is spot metering. The PZ1 measures the exposure for a small zone in the center of the frame. Using Pentax Function 1, you can choose center-weighted metering instead of spot metering. We'll show you how to do that in the Pentax Function section. The PZ1 has a memory lock function that's very effective when you use it in the spot metering mode. Put the spot metering area over the part of the scene you want measured. Then press the memory lock button on the back of the camera. You'll notice the memory lock star indicator in the viewfinder. The PZ1 will remember the exposure level as long as you hold the shutter release button halfway down, or for 5 seconds after you release it. You can then choose the composition you want and take the picture. The PZ1 lets you pick from 6 different exposure modes. To select one, set the aperture ring to A. Set the mode dial to mode. Hold down the set button and turn the TV direct dial. You'll see an icon for each mode: hyper-programmed auto exposure, programmed auto exposure, shutter priority auto exposure, aperture priority auto exposure, hyper manual, and manual or bulb exposure. If the aperture ring is in a position other than A, you can choose only aperture priority auto exposure, hyper manual, or manual. The hyper-programmed auto exposure mode offers you the speed and ease of programmed auto exposure, but lets you instantly switch to shutter priority or aperture priority auto exposure. To switch to shutter priority auto exposure, just turn the TV direct dial and pick the shutter speed you want. You'll know you're in shutter priority because the line under the shutter speed lights up in the viewfinder. The PZ1 will set the correct aperture. To select aperture priority auto exposure, just turn the AV direct dial and choose an aperture setting you want. You'll know you're in aperture priority because the line under the aperture setting lights up in the viewfinder. The PZ1 will select the correct shutter speed. In programmed auto exposure, the PZ1 sets both the shutter speed and the aperture. Pentax Function 2 lets you weight programmed auto exposure pictures for action or depth of field. If you've selected shutter priority auto exposure, Use the TV direct dial to select your shutter speed. The PZ1 will automatically set the aperture. You can then change the shutter speed to create a different effect. Aperture Priority Auto Exposure lets you pick the aperture, and the PZ1 sets the correct shutter speed. It gives you control over the depth of field. You select an aperture setting using the AV direct dial. For instance, you might want a large depth of field to capture this landscape. Hyper Manual gives you complete control of the aperture and shutter speed, but keeps auto exposure at your fingertips in case you want it. You use the TV direct dial to select a shutter speed and the AV direct dial to set the aperture. Pressing the shutter release halfway lets you see the shutter speed, aperture, and exposure meter readings through the lens. The plus sign means the subject is overexposed, and the minus sign means it's underexposed. Both together mean you have the correct exposure. If you don't have time to set the exposure while in hyper manual mode, you can press the IF button at any time, and the PZ1 will automatically set the right exposure. While in hyper manual mode, with the aperture ring at the A position, set your exposure. If you press the memory lock button, the PZ1 memorizes the exposure value. You can then change the shutter speed, and the PZ1 will automatically adjust the aperture to keep the exposure value you set. For scenes that require a long exposure, use the manual or bulb mode. Use the AV direct dial to set the aperture you want. Then hold the shutter release open for the length of the exposure. Exposure compensation lets you deliberately over or underexpose your subject, for instance, to get the correct exposure for these skiers' faces. Press and hold the exposure compensation button on the back of the camera. You can then use the TV direct dial to compensate in either direction up to 4 EV, or stops, in 0.3 EV increments. Pentax Function 3 lets you change the exposure compensation increment to 0.5 EV. To select a drive mode, set the mode dial to drive. Hold down the set button and turn the TV direct dial. The PZ1 lets you select from 8 different drive modes: single frame, multi-frame consecutive, auto bracketing, multiple exposure, interval timer, triple frame consecutive self-timer, self-timer with 2-second delay, and self-timer with 12-second delay. If you want to make certain you have a correctly exposed picture, use auto bracketing. You'll get 3 pictures at different exposures. Hold down the set button while turning the AV direct dial to the exposure compensation value you want. It changes in 0.3 EV increments. Incidentally, to illuminate the LCD panel, press the exposure compensation and metering mode switch buttons at the same time. It will stay illuminated for 5 seconds, or for as long as you hold the shutter release button down halfway. Bracketing ensures you'll get the exposure you want. If you're sure that the picture you want needs to be over or underexposed, you can use exposure compensation together with auto bracketing. If, for example, you want all of the bracketed photographs to be overexposed, select auto bracketing mode with a 0.3 EV compensation increment. While holding down the exposure compensation button on the back of the camera, Turn the TV direct dial to change the overall exposure value to the overexposure you want. For example, 0.3 EV. The first frame will be overexposed by 0.3 EV, the second by the exposure level indicated by the meter, and the third will be overexposed by 0.6 EV. To take multiple exposures, set the PZ1 to the multiple exposure mode. Then, while holding down the Set button, turn the AV direct dial to set the number of exposures you want. You can take as many as 9. The number will be indicated on the LCD panel. As you take the pictures, the number on the LCD panel will count down. The interval shooting mode lets you take a series of pictures at a pre-programmed time in the future. You can set the time until the first picture, the interval between pictures, and the number of pictures to be taken. After selecting the drive mode INT, hold down the Set button for 2 seconds. INT will blink on the LCD panel. Release the Set button. To set the time until shooting starts, turn the TV direct dial until ST is displayed on the LCD panel. Now turn the AV direct dial to set the seconds, minutes, or hours until you want the shooting to begin. To set the interval between exposures, turn the TV direct dial until 2 INT indicators show on the panel. Again, turn the AV direct dial to select the time between exposures. Now set the number of frames by turning the TV direct dial until the number of frames appears and the AV direct dial to set the number you want. Select a shooting mode and press the shutter release all the way down. Place the cap over the viewfinder to keep light from entering and overexposing the shot. The self-timer delays the release of the shutter for about 12 seconds. After selecting the self-timer mode, focus on your subject with the shutter release held halfway down. If you don't use memory lock, use the cap to keep light from entering the viewfinder. Then press the shutter release button all the way down. The self-timer lamp and an electronic beep indicate that the timer is working. About 2 seconds before the shutter is released, the light starts blinking and the beeps get faster. You can use the 2-second self-timer to prevent camera shake. Select the 2-second delay mode, focus on your subject, press the memory lock button, then press the shutter release button all the way down. Triple frame self-timer mode takes 3 consecutive pictures about 12 seconds after the shutter release button is pressed. Select triple frame self-timer mode. Start it the same way you start the 12-second self-timer. After the 12 seconds, the PZ1 will take 3 pictures 2 seconds apart. Zoom clip mode remembers 1 or 2 focal lengths that you preset so you can call them up with the touch of a button. The PZ1 comes set for 1 clip, but using Pentax function 14, you can choose 2. To set the focal lengths, hold the auto zoom switch toward the auto set or AS position. Turn the TV direct dial until the zoom clip icon blinks. Use the power zoom ring to pick a focal length. Now press the Zoom Set button on the lens. The zoom clip icon stops blinking, indicating that the focal length is stored. Use the same steps to set the second focal length. As you press the auto zoom button, the lens automatically switches from one focal length to the other. Image size tracking automatically zooms in or out to keep your subject the same size in the frame. To set the image size, hold the auto zoom switch toward AS. Turn the TV direct dial until the image size tracking icon shows on the LCD panel. Hold the shutter release button down halfway and turn the power zoom ring to choose the image size you want. Now, as you and your subject move, the PZ1's lens zooms in and out to keep the image size from changing. Pentax function 13 lets you choose between the image size you set or between two preset image sizes, waist up or full body, each time you turn on the camera. In zoom effect, the PZ1 zooms from wide angle to telephoto during the exposure. While holding the auto zoom switch toward AS, turn the TV direct dial until you see the zoom effect icon on the LCD panel. Turn the power zoom ring to a wide angle setting. Press the shutter release all the way down. Pentax function 16 lets you reverse the zoom direction. High-speed flash sync lets you use the built-in flash to freeze fast-moving subjects. Use shutter priority auto exposure and a shutter speed of up to 1/250th of a second. Slow speed sync lets you photograph a subject in the dark against a lighted background. While in the shutter priority auto exposure or hyper manual mode, use the built-in flash. If you set a shutter speed and the aperture setting blinks, the correct aperture isn't available. Adjust the shutter speed until the blinking stops. The PZ1 and the built-in TTL flash will automatically provide enough light to illuminate your subject. Turn the mode dial to PF. While holding down the set button, turn the TV direct dial to the left until the PF on the LCD panel disappears. Release the set button and turn the TV direct dial to the left 3 clicks. The film will rewind. The PZ1 has 18 Pentax functions that let you customize the camera to fit your own requirements. To set Pentax functions, set the mode dial to Pentax function. While holding down the set button, turn the TV direct dial until the film icon clears. Release the set button. Turn the TV direct dial to the right to select the number of the Pentax function you want. Turn the AV direct dial to select the setting within that function. Pentax function 1 replaces spot metering with center-weighted metering. That gives more weight to the exposure in the center portion of the frame. Setting 0 is the spot metering mode. Setting 1 is center-weighted metering mode. Changing the program line lets you change the way the PZ1 selects aperture and shutter speed when shooting in programmed or hyper-programmed auto exposure. Setting 0 is the normal program line. Setting 1 is the program action line. Setting 2 is the program depth line. And setting 3 is the MTF program line, which automatically selects the aperture that produces the sharpest picture for a Pentax FA lens. In Program Action Line, the PZ1 chooses the fastest possible shutter speed to freeze fast action. In Program Depth Line, the PZ1 chooses the greatest possible depth of field. Pentax Function 3 lets you select the exposure compensation increment. At setting 0, the PZ1 compensates in 0.3 EV increments. And at setting 1, in 0.5 EV increments. Pentax Function 4 lets you select the shutter speed increment. At setting 0, the increment is 1 EV. At setting 1, the increment is 0.5 EV. Pentax Function 5, selecting the type of TV-AV shift, lets you choose how the PZ1 handles an impossible exposure setting in the hyper-programmed mode. Setting 0 is automatic shift, which means the camera will automatically shift the shutter speed or aperture for a correct exposure. At setting 1, the PZ1 warns you that the values are incorrect and allows you to take the picture. Pentax Function 6 lets you select the type of TV-AV shift when the IF button is pressed in the hyper-manual mode. At setting 0, the camera will take the correct exposure level from the program line. At setting 1, it will keep the aperture setting fixed and adjust the shutter speed. At setting 2, it will keep the shutter speed fixed and adjust the aperture. Pentax Function 7 lets you select the type of TV-AV values used when the IF button is pressed in the hyper-manual mode. At setting 0, the shutter speed and aperture setting adjust in steps. At 1, the shutter speed and aperture adjust continuously. Pentax Function 8 lets you select the method of film speed setting. Setting 0 gives priority to automatic setting of the film speed according to the DX code on the roll, although you can still set it manually. At setting 1, you must manually set the film speed. To do that, turn the mode dial to ISO. While holding down the Set button, turn the TV Direct dial to set the film speed. Pentax Function 9 lets you select the built-in flash discharge mode. At setting 0, the flash will fire even if the camera is warning you that the lens range is not covered by the built-in flash. At setting 1, the flash will not fire if the lens is not covered by the built-in flash. Pentax function 10 lets you select whether or not the shutter will release before the built-in flash is fully charged. At setting 0, the shutter will release before the flash is fully charged. At setting 1, release is locked until the flash charges completely. Pentax function 11 lets you adjust the film rewind. At setting 0, the film is rewound completely into the film cartridge. At setting 1, the film leader is left outside the cartridge. Pentax function 12 lets you select the film rewinding mode. At setting 0, the film starts rewinding automatically at the end of the roll. At setting 1, you have to manually start rewinding. Pentax function 13 lets you select the initial magnification in the image size tracking mode each time you turn on the camera. Setting 0 uses the image size you previously set. Setting 1 automatically sets a full-size shot of a person. Setting 2 automatically sets a waist-up shot of a person. Pentax function 14 lets you select the number of focal length settings memorized in the zoom clip mode. Setting 0 is for 1 focal length. Setting 1 is for 2 focal lengths. Pentax function 15 lets you select power zoom operation. At setting 0, the power zoom ring is disabled while the shutter is open for an exposure. At setting 1, you can use the power zoom while the shutter is open. Pentax function 16 lets you switch the direction of the zoom in zoom effect mode. At setting 0, the lens zooms from wide angle to telephoto. At setting 1, the lens zooms from telephoto to wide angle. Pentax function 17 lets you select the function of the ML button. At setting 0, when you press the ML button, only the exposure is fixed. At setting 1, pressing the ML button fixes both the exposure and the focus. Pentax function 18 lets you select the shutter release timing in the image size tracking mode. At setting 0, the shutter releases when the subject comes into focus, even if the image size is not constant. At setting 1, the shutter releases only when the image size is constant. To initialize Pentax functions, which means resetting them to 0, set the mode dial to PF. While holding down the Set button, turn the TV direct dial to clear the film icon. While continuing to hold down the Set button, press the IF button. CL on the LCD panel will indicate that the Pentax functions have been reset. The PZ1 helps you put your creative ideas on film. If you have any questions about how to use or care for your PZ1, or if you need any troubleshooting information, please see the instruction booklet that came with the camera.